Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Fagoshnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts, including, well, this one, and let's say theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, welcome to life after the Super Bowl. I feel like this is like the post-snap version of the NFL.
Yeah, it really is. It feels like everything is less than, it's diminished. We still want to operate as if everything's normal, but clearly that's not the case.
The Met Stadium is also empty.
Well, I mean, that was...
It was going to be like that anyway, I suppose.
Yeah, that's the
same. Some things are the same pre and post snap. Well, welcome to the episode. Obviously, the Super Bowl has come and gone. Someone won, someone lost. I feel like we all lost in some way. And the prop bet situation did not end up going out the way that that we had hoped or that we had planned. Mainly Dusty's bet about was it the hat? That got the most action, that was just such a disappointment that it basically could have been called Dusty.
Wow, that was a drive-by shooting. Yeah, I mean, I don't even remember what the bet was with the hat.
The hat was whether or not Adam Levine would come out in a hat, and instead he did not come out with a hat and just started stripping. To the point where even Janet Jackson thought it was too much.
Right. Yeah. We got the full set of nips.
He was just slowly becoming David Beckham at that point.
Yeah, it was a lot more jarring because it was Adam Levine and not like Anthony Kiedis. Right? You're like, well, yeah, I mean, of course he's shirtless. That's like who he is as a person. But Adam Levine, you're like, I didn't even know he had tattoos. That's wild. Why? Why does he have tattoos?
Exactly. If I'm going to see a big shirtless guy on stage, it might as well just be Bert Kreischer and not be Adam Levine. But that's my take on things. Let's talk about a couple things because we are coming back. Now we are talking about off-season stuff, which we will be broadcasting a little less than normal. Well, less than the regular season anyway. It's about once every 2 weeks or so when major Vikings news hits or when we need to mock some drafts. So let's start off with a couple of things. We're a little bit out of practice, but let's see if I can get back into it. If you would like to donate to the show, if you hear value in what we produce, you can do it in one of two different ways. You can go to patreon.com/Norse Code and donate there. That's more of a monthly subscription sort of thing. Or you can go to paypal.me/Norse Code, and that works as well. We do have a donation to discuss this week, and actually we were going to do it on the Dusty show, and then it just didn't end up making it into the show notes for that one, so apologies. But this is from Chris in New York. Said, my wife and I had a great time hanging out with you guys at the live show in New York. Thank you, Chris. They were awesome. I believe, yeah, he was the one who was at the tailgate as well. So that was awesome. Chris and his wife were really cool to hang out with at the live show at Bar None last year.
Yeah, that was fun.
That was a hell of a time. And we didn't have a bunch of technical issues. It was just issues around us that were causing things to be technically wrong, I suppose. I'm still amazed that the episodes haven't been taken off of the two live shows we did haven't been taken off of off of like Spotify or off of iTunes because of like copyright problems with the music that was happening in the background. It's like slowly but surely the DJ at Bar None was just trying to make our lives miserable. Like, we're going to play as much loud 90s as we can, which is fine, but when we were supposed to be reserved for the space and it just like was passive aggressively getting louder. Like, really? This is a thing, huh? All right. So again, if you'd like to donate to the show, patreon.com/Norse Code or to paypal.me/Norse Code. Anything is appreciated. Tree Fitty to help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay is always appreciated. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of things. We have some new coaches to talk about that we did not have a chance to discuss on the Dusty show. We can start with Rick Dennison, who is the offensive line coach. There were plenty of interesting names that were going to potentially be the offensive line coach, and then it ended up being Rick Dennison, which...
Yeah. Yeah.
It seems like not a sexy hire. Certainly not one that that was on the radar of some. But is this a positive step?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like, no offensive line hire is going to be like really sexy unless it's like Howard Mudd or Dante Scarnecchia, and then everyone's like, "Oh yeah, real football guys knows that that he's an elite offensive line coach or something." And so then you're left with like a bunch of like really good offensive line coaches like Frank Polak and recently Dave DiGuglielmo, and you could say, well, historically, they're good, but no one's ever really like sexy. The Dennison hire. That one you could see coming just because, he's had such a strong history with Gary Kubiak that, Kubiak tends to kind of just bring his people around with him. And so, like, if they don't already have a job or something, Kubiak is kind of willing to hire them. And luckily, they tend to be pretty good, although sometimes it causes problems. So when the Denver Broncos wanted Kubiak to be their offensive coordinator, he kind of insisted that he have Brian Pariani, who is also one of the new hires for the Vikings at tight ends coach, and Rick Dennison be the offensive line coach. And the Broncos had just like 2 years prior had fired Pariani and maybe Dennison. I don't think so. But, they didn't want to bring Pariani back. And that was such a big sticking point for Kubiak that he chose not to take the offensive coordinator job. That and in part with like also he had some serious health concerns. That he decided to be like an offensive advisor instead of the offensive coordinator because he couldn't have all of his guys. So he's really big on loyalty, and Dennison is just kind of one of the guys that he's brought around. And a lot of people are familiar with Kubiak teams from like a head coaching perspective, which is they didn't really get everything done with Houston that they wanted to, but as an offensive coordinator, they've been pretty effective, especially running the ball. They're really well known for running the wide zone. And Dennison is a big part of that as the offensive line coach. Offensive line coaches tend to be run game coordinators, which was his official title with the New York Jets. Very often it's not even an official title, but an unofficial responsibility. And to kind of emphasize the importance of this responsibility, there's a quote from Aaron Kromer, the offensive line coach with the Los Angeles Rams, where he's talking about, how much he appreciates Sean McVay as the head coach and play caller, because he brings up the fact that McVay asked him a lot about the differences in different types of run calls and techniques. And so like, hey, when you call, boss, what does this mean? Right? Or when you call, power toss versus crack toss, what does this mean? And stuff like that, which is weird, right? Because you think offensive coordinator / play caller, kind of everything that comes with the plays that you're calling. But very often the run game coordinator takes such a heavy role in design for the run game that it's actually not that common for offensive coordinators to have as in-depth of an understanding of the run game as they do of the passing game, right? Because they know like the footwork a wide receiver needs on any route concept that they'll run, on any play that they'll run. Whereas for, a run, they don't know kind of what changes when you've got an odd 3-4 versus an even 3-4 versus an even 4-3 for the same running play, right? So that's kind of fascinating, but it means that the offensive line coach is so critical to the execution of the run game and the design of the run game that they often have a bigger effect and impact than anything a lot of people suspect. So knowing that he's been the offensive line coach for Kubiak-oriented teams, I think tells us a lot about kind of the direction the run game will be going, which is to implement even more of the outside zone stuff that Kubiak has been famous for with Houston and with Denver. And it's produced some really good running back performances from running backs that people regard really highly, like Arian Foster, to running backs that people are maybe a little bit less familiar with, or like their backups like Alfred Blue and Ben Tate. So that's kind of exciting. If you take a look at Dennison's history at offensive line coach, it's really spotty, which in some ways can be good because it means he keeps on getting promoted up from offensive line coach to offensive coordinator, which is great. But it does mean we have a pretty poor ability to evaluate his tenure because, he was an offensive line coach in partnership with Diaz Infante, who was actually an offensive lineman for him a couple years prior. But he was an offensive line coach for the New York Jets in 2018, which was not good. And then the last time before that he was an offensive line coach was 2009. And that was only 1 year with the Denver Broncos. And that was good. That was a good set of years. And then before that, 2001 to 2005. So 15 years ago, right? So it's very difficult to evaluate how good of an offensive line coach he is, especially because, the NFL in 2005 is so substantially different than the NFL in 2019, just because the offensive linemen that are coming in have significantly less experience in training because they come out of like spread sets. The quarterbacks are going to be dropping at different drop depths. You have very few under center plays nowadays. And so a lot of things change, and you can't scheme up these 7-step drops, which give, the offensive lineman and the quarterback, maybe a little bit more time and the ability to have more patience or whatever, right? It's a totally different set of techniques and a different set of offensive linemen to work with. So it's kind of difficult to evaluate. His 2018 showing as an offensive line coach wasn't great. 2009 was good. And that's the most recent data we have. You go all the way back to 2001, 2005. It's actually really excellent stuff, but you don't know kind of how much of that will translate 15 years down the road. The best we can take a look at is his history of evaluating offensive linemen, because offensive coordinators and offensive line coaches are very heavily involved at the back end of the scouting process in the final 2 months of the offseason before the draft. They'll input kind of their preferences and kind of reorder the board that the scouts have ordered around. And then obviously a couple months later, when scouts are setting up their list to figure out where they're going to travel and who they're going to visit, they reestablish the criteria that they're looking for in players. So I want to emphasize, movement, right? Or I want to emphasize grip strength or something like that. And so they'll figure out based on their emphases kind of which offensive linemen are best fit. So they have a pretty significant role. And Dennison and the staffs that he's been on have done really incredible work finding offensive linemen who outperform their pick value. So, Deion Dawkins with Buffalo, kind of the lone bright spot on that Buffalo offense. You can go all the way back 2001, 2005. He's produced, a couple of Pro Bowlers in Houston. They grabbed Brandon Brooks and Chris Myers, who for a while were some of the best at their position. Dwayne Brown, the tackle for the Houston Texans, who's now, I think, in Seattle. There's some really excellent acquisitions, and they generally outperform their pick value. There've been very few disappointments. People like Tyson Braylo with the Denver Broncos, and mostly a bunch of really, really good successes. So that's really good to see. But for the most part, we don't have a lot of specific information about Dennison. If you want to read more about this in detail, I, of course, wrote it up at The Athletic a couple of weeks ago. I'll link to that in the show notes. But that's kind of the rundown of Dennison.
So it wasn't just an offensive line coach that we ended up getting. We also ended up looking at special teams as well with Marwan Malouf. Is that right?
Yeah. So the former assistant special teams coordinator for the Miami Dolphins. Kind of interesting because there's a rumor that the Vikings were looking at Darren Reese, which I had incorrectly reported that the Vikings had just hired on this podcast a couple of weeks ago. My bad. But they were looking at him. And what's interesting is that the Dolphins were actually, before they hired Brian Flores, the linebackers coach or former linebackers coach for the Patriots, they were interviewing Darren Reese for a head coach position. So that's kind of curious. But the Dolphins are decently well known to have a pretty good special teams unit. If you head over to like Dolphins blogs, like the Finsider and stuff like that, and you take a look at the past couple of months of conversations about their special teams units and stuff like that, it's almost universally positive. They really like what Darren Reese has done with them. In particular, finding specialists like Matt Darr, the punter, or finding some really good, special team kind of coordination and units. So they've got, I think everyone kind of remembers the 2014 punt block that Terrence Fede had against the Vikings that I think they scored a touchdown off of it. If not, they got a safety off of it that ended up being pretty significant. But they have kind of a history of like, punt blocks and some pretty interesting highlight plays on special teams. And generally speaking, the conversation around them has been positive. Marwan Malouf being the assistant special teams coordinator, you kind of hope that some of that's going to translate. Ultimately, you don't know, but it's more positive than anything else. It's like, I have no idea what to make of this hire, but there's more reasons to be optimistic than not.
Well, we'll certainly take that after the years of negativity that we've been dealing with. Tight ends coach, Brian Perini?
Yeah, Brian Periani.
Periani, that's right.
Yeah. He's not a guy I know a ton about. I asked some local Denver people, hey, what do you think of this guy? And he's like, well, they fired him, so, which is great. But one interesting thing I found is you can kind of tell how much influence a position coach has by taking a look at how consistent the players they acquire for that position are. Because the more consistent they are, the less of a voice that coach has in coaching, and probably less of an effect that coach has in coaching that position group. So for wide receivers, you can see as wide receivers coaches change across the NFL, those teams' priorities at wide receiver change. They either get like bigger receivers or faster receivers, or quicker receivers, or receivers that have more of an ability to jump or whatever, based off of who that wide receivers coach is and what their emphasis is. But like running backs coaches and tight ends coaches, teams, if they have a model at running back or tight end, will kind of stick to that model. Regardless of who the tight ends coach is. And one good example is actually the Vikings. So the Vikings have had a lot of tight ends coaches, including their current offensive coordinator, Kevin Stefanski, the previous offensive coordinator, Pat Shurmur, Todd Downing, the tight ends coach. Clancy Barone was a tight ends coach for half of an offseason. And now, of course, they've got Brian Periani. And over the course of those like 4 or 5 tight ends coaches that they've had, they've been really consistent about the kinds of tight ends that they acquire. It hasn't been as important that they get fast tight ends, but they still have some of the same athletic requirements from them, which I also wrote up recently at The Athletic. I'll link that and so on. So it may not matter, but he doesn't have a good history. If you take a look at, for example, why the Broncos might have fired him, you can take a look at their history at tight end. Julius Thomas, Orange Julius, was a success for about 1 year with Peyton Manning. But other than that, they've had a bunch of tight ends who've got a lot of potential. People like Virgil Green, for example, who haven't like panned out, and they've continuously needed to invest at that position. So that's not great, but also I'm not confident how much of an impact a tight ends coach has. So, we'll see. The Vikings have depth concerns at tight end. They want to get a tight end 2 or 3, depending on how you kind of define David Morgan. But they definitely don't have additional tight ends to fill in if, say, for example, Kyle Rudolph or David Morgan get injured. Because at this point, I don't really trust Tyler Conklin all that much, and he had a really poor training camp. He didn't have a phenomenal season, which is fine. He's like a 5th round pick or whatever. And so, you can give him a little bit more time. But, I don't trust that as the answer. Be nice to have an additional tight end. And so I don't know if, Pariani has the ability to identify or coach that new tight end. But at the same time, I'm not going to be super pessimistic about like a tight ends coach. So, whatever.
Well, yeah, being super pessimistic about a tight ends coach would be a bit odd, but, on brand for this show anyway. And maybe it's a situation where with everything kind of going to the run, that he's kind of being brought on more as a coach for run blocking tight ends as opposed to pass catching tight ends sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. That'd be kind of a novel approach, I think. And, I don't hate it. I mean, some teams have like defensive back coaches, while other ones have safety coaches and cornerback coaches. And some teams have, defensive line coaches like the Vikings. And some teams have like defensive tackle and defensive end coaches, or, outside linebacker and inside linebacker and defensive line coaches that are all distinct from each other. If you split up the tight end duties to be, focus on receiving, focus on blocking, I don't hate it. The only issue is that you don't really care if your defensive tackles can play defensive end, but you do care if your receiving tight end can't block. Like, it does impact what you can do. So you do want crossover, but, I don't hate the idea.
Yeah. Well, the other coach that we could talk about is Drew Petzing, and I believe he's with the wide receivers.
Yeah, so he's the wide receivers coach. He was the assistant wide receivers coach for the past couple of years, and kind of before that, he's floated around. He was an offensive assistant, just kind of generally an offensive assistant. I think he was an assistant quarterbacks coach under Stefanski. Yeah, I mean, we don't know that much about him. This is just kind of, every so often NFL teams, hire in-house with a guy who doesn't have a bunch of history, and you kind of hope it works out. And sometimes you get, Sean McVay, and sometimes you don't, right? So he's a guy we don't have a ton of history for. It'll be interesting to see, when the Vikings, either draft a wide receiver or two, or sign a bunch of wide receivers on undrafted free agency, or most likely both, what they tend to focus on in terms of the skill set they want. Do they want receivers that can go up and get it and win contested catches? Do they want receivers that can win deep downfield? Do they want receivers that are technicians? Do they want receivers who are naturally quick? Who knows? It'll be interesting to see kind of what that emphasis is. But yeah, there's not a history to point to. But I guess, the fact that he was the assistant receivers coach with Diggs and Thielen, that's not bad. Maybe more important is that he might be really significant in the development of players like Chad Beebe, and Beebe obviously did a really kind of phenomenal job as far as undrafted rookies go, especially with his athletic profile. So, we'll see, how important he's been and what he'll be able to do. But I don't know. The Vikings have kind of low key gone through wide receivers coaches a little bit too.
Well, the next thing that we should probably talk about is with free agency coming up here. It's open, and the franchise tag is available, but the Daily Norseman has reported that it's not likely that the Vikings are going to end up using that on anybody. What do you think?
Yeah, that makes sense. There was some rumor that, maybe the Vikings would use it on Anthony Barr, and I just didn't see that, because the huge problem with the franchise tag as it pertains to the linebacker position is that it doesn't make distinctions between type, right? And so you're grouping in players with a linebacker designation like Von Miller, who gets paid $21 million a year, with Luke Kuechly, who gets paid I think 13, something like that. They're both at the top of their position, and one gets paid nearly double, right? And so because the franchise tag is calculated as the average of the top five, that puts Anthony Barr in potentially $17.5 million territory. And I know that sounds really high. I know a lot of people projected $15 million because last year the tag was at $14.9 million. But the Von Miller contract, the Khalil Mack contract, and I think another restructure for somebody else really bumped up the edge rusher value, and those edge rushers happen to be linebackers. And so now it's just huge. And so it wouldn't have made sense to use it on Anthony Barr. And I have no idea who else you would use it on, because you're not going to use it on Anthony Harris, who you can probably get. It really depends. I still don't know if he's a restricted free agent. I think he's not, but Spotrac listed him as an RFA. Over the cap lists him as an unrestricted free agent. And obviously, if he's a restricted free agent, it's very easy. You just put the a second round tender on him or whatever and pay him $3 million. But you don't want to pay him the average of the top five safety salaries, and you don't need to, because you could probably sign him to a long term deal. So you wouldn't use it on Tom Johnson or Tom Compton, right? So there's no reason to use it except on either Sheldon Richardson or Anthony Barr. And so that's not a surprise. I suppose they could have used it on Sheldon, but, with the draft class this deep at defensive tackle, it kind of doesn't make sense. And that doesn't mean they shouldn't re-sign Sheldon or whatever. They might, prefer to do that. But that's a lot of money because of, people like Aaron Donald and Ndamukong Suh ramping up the franchise tag cost of defensive tackles.
Yeah, and Sheldon Richardson was a great Viking. It's just the question of how much are we willing to dedicate as far as the cap space is concerned.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I'm not surprised. If the franchise tag gets revamped so that off-ball linebackers are treated differently than on-ball linebackers or edge rushers or whatever, I think it would have made sense to use it on Anthony Barr, because it would have been $12 million, or just $2 million more than the $10 million I'd prefer to sign him at. But yeah, I mean, yeah, and you got control for another year. You can kind of evaluate, if he can really bounce back and play at a consistent level or not. But I mean, not for 17 or whatever it would end up being. That's absurd.
Yeah, just a little bit more expensive than we're willing to be paying for.
Yeah, it would have been fun to use it on like Dan Bailey. Like I remember when the Patriots used it on Gostkowski a few years ago. And everyone's like, well, that's weird. Oh, well, it's like $1.4 million. Who cares?
Be like, well, we're going to use it in a way that isn't actually going to kill us. Like, oh, yeah, it's a kicker. It'll be fine.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Well, the Alliance of American Football has been playing, has played 2 weeks, and your Twitter feed is effectively AAF flavored for the weekends. There has been a fair amount of Minnesota Viking players or former players on there, including Matt Asiata. I guess what's your takeaway on the AAF? I haven't had a chance to watch all that much of it, admittedly.
I mean, initially I started out watching it to kind of ironically enjoy it, but I just enjoy it. It's like fun. Like it's nice to have football to watch. But like B, there are a lot of players here that I've been vaguely familiar with for a while, right? Like I just tweeted out about like the backup linebacker for the San Diego Fleet, Frank Ginda, is a guy that I remember I wrote like 2 sentences about last year because he had these crazy good tackle numbers in college and he tested really surprisingly well. And I was like, oh, he'd be kind of an interesting like day 3 pick for somebody, maybe the Vikings, right? Like he tested in the 4.6s in the 40, which I think was a surprise to a lot of people. And so that put him on the radar for me because the Vikings tend to really like linebackers who run below a 4.7. And so, he got great tackle share numbers. He had great athletic testing, or surprisingly good athletic testing, I should say. And like the way that people talked about him for San Diego State was just like off the charts, like really good, like leadership and stuff like that, right? And so I was like, oh, cool. So I wrote like 2 sentences about him or whatever. And there's a lot of players where I've like written maybe 1 or 2 sentences or, I've become like kind of vaguely familiar with like throughout the process. And then there's players every so often where like, oh yeah, that guy. Like Demontre Moore, I think was like a 3rd round pick for the New York Giants, 3rd or 4th round. Terry Poole was a guy that I was looking at for a hot second in free agency for the Vikings. He plays tackle. Avery Genesee was something like a 3rd or 4th round pick. So these are players I'm just like, oh, yeah, I remember him. Matt Asiata, obviously, for Vikings fans. Trent Richardson, the number 3 overall pick, is the starting running back for the Birmingham Iron. So there's a couple of those guys. And so the combination of like guys that I've become kind of familiar with, Luis Perez, and guys I have no idea about, John Walford, and guys that I have become pretty familiar with, like Matt Asiata. I think a combination of those people getting together is really like super interesting. And I'm learning about different new players I've never heard of like every week and watching them and paying attention and seeing like, oh, hey, this guy's nickname is Big Play McKay, right? Which, obviously, he was great in high school and I guess he was good in college or whatever. Oh, he's actually like pretty good. Cool. That kind of stuff. So I was
comparing it to the 8th and 9th and 10th rounds of fantasy drafts. Like players you may see in there are the ones that are making bigger plays inside of the AAF.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. Right. And it's like, and I think there's a lot of players where you're like, oh, I drafted him on my team like in the 14th round 3 years ago. I wonder how he's pretty good.
I keep waiting for Dexter McCluster. Like I just keep waiting for it.
Right, yeah, exactly. And it would totally be like, that's reasonable that he's in the AAF, right? And so there's a bunch of fun ones. I mean, Charles Johnson just, I guess, set the AAF. I mean, everything's an AAF record at this point. But he had like 192 yards on like 7 catches. It was great. And like Charles Johnson is like fun. Like he's a fun dude. So I'm always kind of rooting for him because he's got like this big personality or whatever. Like maybe he couldn't figure it out with the Vikings, but like it was fun seeing him kill it. And he did it against like 3 different cornerbacks too. Like, I forget who Orlando was playing, but like, was it Salt Lake? Whatever. They put like one cornerback on him and he burned him 3 times. They were like, well, that's not happening again. So they put another cornerback on him, and he just like roasted that dude. It was great. Like, so it's been a lot of fun. Some of the games have been blowouts, whatever, that's fine. Some of the games have been really close. We just saw a really great fourth quarter comeback where Arizona came back against Memphis of all teams. I shouldn't say of all teams. No one knows who these teams are. But Memphis is like, they're quarterbacked by Hackenberg. Like, they're a really bad team, but, they had a defensive score and they had a couple of turnovers early in the game. And so, they were in scoring position a lot. And so Arizona, which everyone who cared put at the top of the AAF standings or behind Orlando anyway, was like down to Memphis. And nobody thinks Memphis is good. Down 18-6 because there's no extra points, just 2-point conversions. And John Wolford, the quarterback, he's like the 6'1" guy from Wake Forest. He set a bunch of Wake Forest passing records. I had never heard of him before the AAF. And right now he's like the second best quarterback or the third best quarterback. And he mounts this comeback where, so for the first 6 drives, he has like a 40% completion rate. He's throwing 4 yards an attempt, and it's only that high because he completed a 22-yard pass that ended up getting fumbled by the receiver anyway. So he had this like awful start to the game. And he mounts this comeback where he only has 3 incompletions. In fact, for the second half, he only has 1 incompletion, and it's a dropped pass. Like, he kills it on this comeback, and he brings them back with a fourth quarter comeback on a couple of touchdown drives with a bunch of deep passes. Like, it's just really fun. And so, yeah, there's like some entertaining football. Like, you don't have to have like high quality football, right? I mean, like, a bunch of people like will watch North Dakota State destroy some poor Missouri Valley Conference team, and they'll set attendance record numbers. Like, it doesn't matter, right? Like, sometimes football can just be entertaining without it being super high quality. And there are some really high quality players, and they're somewhat evenly distributed throughout the league. So you actually do get a bunch of really fun highlight splash plays and some really competitive football. Like, there was one game this weekend that wasn't that great to watch. And, a bunch of people had takes during the game that like, AAF needs to fix this. But like, honestly, if like 75% of your games are like entertaining, you're doing really well. So I've been enjoying the league a lot. I've been doing it enough that I've written about standouts at each position every week, which I won't be able to do every week this offseason, but I'll be trying to do it as often as I can, depending on, my Viking schedule, because obviously that comes first. But yeah, Jarrell Presley, former Viking, he had a great week 1. Charles Johnson, like I mentioned, had a great week 2. Matt Asiata, showed up and had a touchdown in week 1, which is great. A bunch of former Vikings have been playing, a bunch of former everybody, right? But like, people I'm familiar with. I remember Pierce Burton, offensive tackle for the Arizona Hotshots. He's the second string offensive tackle, but he replaces Brant Weiss, who I wrote about in week 1 as one of the stand-up performers, but he got injured that week. And so he had this great game. He gets injured near the end of the game. It sucks. Pierce Burton has to play, and I was like, that name sounds super familiar. So I look up like the 2014 Vikings training camp guide, and he's in there, and I wrote about him. I was like, oh, yeah, he went to like Ole Miss, and he's like, this big guy that I was like, well, maybe they want to move him to guard or something. I don't know. And it turns out, he was originally a guard for Arizona, the Hotshots. They moved him to tackle because this guy, Brant Weiss, goes down, and he has a hell of a game. He does a really good job. So, yeah, I don't know. It's been fun. I encourage people to watch it. The problem is like, half the games are on like CBS Sportsnet, which nobody has. But, a lot of them are on NFL Network. They're going to be on Bleacher Report Live. They're also on the internet. No one's really cracking down on that yet. So there's that. And also, and most of the games are streamed through their app or through their website at AAF.com too. So it's fun stuff.
And Christian Hackenberg is still terrible.
Yeah, like atrociously terrible. That's fun too, honestly. Like, you're just like, yeah, I knew that guy was bad, and he continues to validate me at the lowest level of professional football. This is great. Like, I'm always a little bit mean-spirited, so there's some of that in there. But
you mean-spirited?
I know, it's weird.
What?
I know. It's turning over a new leaf. I've become meaner. Yeah. I know I've been this angel who only drops praise, very positive. But, I gotta add a little bit of edge, That's what the kids like these days.
I don't know what the kids. I don't even know what the kids liked when I was a kid. So mock drafts are all the rage at the moment. Everyone seems to have one. I can never get into the whole mock draft thing because the moment a trade happens, all that hard work goes down to nothing, or in my mind feels like it goes down to nothing. But where are the mocks putting Vikings picks? Like what seems to be the consensus as far as Viking strategy?
Well, so it seems like, well, actually maybe the best place to look would be at the dailynorseman.com where they always have like a great, I don't know if they've put out their first one yet this year, but they've got this mock draft tracker that takes a look at like 50 mock drafts. And I think Chris puts it together, maybe Ted. Either way, I love it. But they have like the percentage of each percentage of mock drafts for which each particular player is taken. So they're a better resource for that than I am. I haven't been reading a ton of mock drafts, but I've seen a lot of Cody Ford in Oklahoma tackle that could play guard, at least for a short period of time before the Vikings kind of move on from Riley Reif, which is the idea, I suppose. And then you can move Ford to left tackle in that situation or move Brian O'Neill over, either way. That's interesting. I think he's a pretty good player. So having him at 18, I wouldn't mind. In some of them, Jonah Williams falls all the way down to the Vikings at 18. That would be, I think, pretty tremendous. He's really good for Alabama, an offensive tackle. I haven't seen a bunch of guards mocked in the first round to the Vikings, a bunch of guard/tackles like Dalton Reisner, Kansas State. I watched the Senior Bowl. I liked him a lot. I've also seen him in mock drafts go from anywhere between the first round and the third round. Like, it's kind of weird. And I suspect that it'll narrow down and meet in the middle. Not because, the middle fallacy or anything like that, but just because there's so many players that are given kind of first round grades that eventually mock drafts end up cycling through them and then they figure out kind of who they want in the first round. And I don't know that Dalton Reisner is better than, a lot of these defensive tackles and defensive ends and stuff. So, he's a guy I see a lot. I saw Chris Lindstrom in the second round of the Vikings. He's a guard from, I want to say Boston College, that I watched in preparation for the Senior Bowl. I liked him a little bit there. Watched him at the Senior Bowl, liked him a lot, and then I went back and watched some of the other tape that I had missed because I'd only watched 2 games, and liked that a lot. So, he's kind of interesting, and I saw him mocked to the Vikings. I saw Garrett Bradbury, North Carolina State center. Don't love him. I think he's a tremendously interesting center. He reminds me a lot of James Daniels, but I see him as a center-only guy, and the people I talk to say he's a center-only guy, and I still don't think the Vikings move on from Pat Elflein. But, I saw a little bit of that. I saw Dane Brugler mocked the Vikings, another first-round corner. He works at The Athletic, and I don't want to impugn any colleagues with significant amounts of criticism, but I got to say I don't really agree with the rationale for that. And I would say that even though the Trey Waynes contract, which is the rationale that he brought up, is in the offing, I think the Vikings probably took care of that with the Mike Hughes pick. So I'm not seeing a ton of picks outside of that. I did see some TJ Hawkinson picks, who's this tight end from Iowa. So the guy so there's 2 essentially, or there's not 2, there's more. But there's 2 Roto World draft people that I follow a lot, and that's Josh Norris, the lead draft guy at Roto World, and then Thor Nystrom, who lives like 2 blocks away from me. So like I'll go over to his place and like watch The Bachelor, which has become a stupid guilty pleasure.
Well, it seems like all sports writers seem to be like they seem to get into The Bachelor like no other show.
Well, I only did it because Mike Renner from PFF was on it, and then I just kept watching it. Like, it just sinks its hooks into you, and it's like just not good. But I have like strong opinions now. I hate it, but I have to, right? Like, there's a lot of like bad reality television that I'll watch, and I'll be like, nope, I'm staking my claim. I genuinely enjoy this. Kid Nation is an objectively bad show, and I love it. Right? Whatever, right? But I don't really like hate the fact that I watch a lot of bad TV all that often. Like, I'm watching Blind Spot right now. It's entertaining. I don't think it's that great. But I don't hate myself for watching it. It's entertaining. It's a little formulaic, but it's a little bit more innovative in what it does for the type of show that it is, the thriller type show, than a lot of other ones. And they fall in tropes, and they've got some bad effects and ADR and editing or whatever, and I don't care. It's fine. And so I don't feel bad for watching a show like that, right? But The Bachelor, I just feel bad. I'm not usually a guy that's who cares about guilty pleasures? If you like it, you like it. I'll shame you online for not liking a thing, but whatever, right? But The Bachelor sucks, and I just keep watching it. Anyway, I was watching it with Thor, and we talked about...
Anyway, getting back to the point.
Yeah, we talked about TJ Hawkinson and Noah Fant, the other tight end from Iowa, who might also be drafted in the first round. And, Thor was on the TJ Hawkinson train from the preseason, right? And Hawkinson obviously played better over the course of the season than Thor anticipated, but in the middle of the season, he and basically him and just Benjamin Solak were I think Hawkinson's the better of the two tight ends, which at the time was a hot take because Noah Fant, the other tight end, everybody had already knew that he was probably going to go in the first round before the season started, whereas not very many people knew about Hawkinson. And Thor staked his claim on that, and Benjamin Solak staked his claim on that. And as the season kind of progressed, a lot more people kind of came around to it. So Thor was talking to me about this guy, and he was talking about it in the most effusive terms. And I was like, Thor, you watch Kansas games and Iowa games, and he's a draft guy, so he watches everybody, right? But I'm like, you watch Kansas games and Iowa games probably more than anybody else does before the draft starts. So, you might be a little bit biased. So I watched a little bit of TJ Hawkinson, and this dude's really good. He's as good as I thought O.J. Howard was. And I loved O.J. Howard so much. I thought, the phrase generational prospect was a phrase that I was willing to use for O.J. Howard, which is a phrase that I know a lot of people hate. Shane Alexander in particular, used to work at Inside the Pylon. He's there's no such thing as a generational prospect. How do you even define generation? I'm sick of the phrase, and people use it every year, and so it doesn't mean anything, right? But I was willing to use it on O.J. Howard because, I didn't think there was a tight end prospect that was as good as him in the past 7 or 8 years. And then, of course, Howard gets drafted, and then 2 years later or whatever, Hawkinson is on the docket, and you're like, oh wow, he's as good as this other guy that I said comes once every decade. But he's great. He's this phenomenal blocking tight end, right? He's incredible as a blocker, and if that's the case, oh wow, if you're the best blocking tight end, you might get drafted in the third round, probably fourth or fifth. But he might be a better receiving tight end than Noah Fant, who is just a receiving tight end. He's a fine blocker, but he's basically a receiving tight end. And he's great. He outgained Fant, I think, in receiving yards. And he's great in the air. He's great at contested catches and stuff like that. He's if David Morgan could run, there's a lot of that going on because Morgan is this really excellent, I'm not going to say receiver, catcher, right? He's great at catching the ball, but he's not a great receiver because he can't get downfield, right? Watching him at Texas San Antonio going up against group of five competition, G5 prospects, not even prospects, right? He looks like he's running through water, right? And he's up against kind of weaker competition, but he caught everything thrown his way, and that's kind of how he is with the Vikings. He catches everything thrown his way. He's great at catching the ball, but he doesn't really get open downfield because he doesn't get downfield. Hawkinson can get downfield too, and so he's like a supercharged David Morgan if you gave David Morgan speed and route running ability. And so I love Hawkinson. So seeing him drafted to the Vikings, I'm really torn, right? Because I'm just tight ends kind of don't matter that much. They're linebackers, right? Linebackers don't really matter that much. And I think that, maybe Barr is a little bit different for some of the reasons I've outlined on previous podcasts. But for the most part, it doesn't really matter. But tight ends are a lot like that. And especially if you already have a starting tight end that's fine, which is Kyle Rudolph. So I'm torn on wow, Hawkinson's really great. He's just excellent. I don't know that he has a weakness. And then you're yeah, but what are the Vikings going to do with him? Right. So that I've seen him a lot in mock drafts. And so I think the premise for that obviously is that the Vikings end up finding, an offensive lineman in free agency if they're really creative about the way that they go about free agency and aggressive about it, or more likely in the second round of the draft. And I still kind of just don't love the value proposition of that. So, I'm really torn. But, those are the guys that I've seen come up a lot in mock drafts. People like Hawkinson, Ford, Williams, a little bit Dalton Reisner. I've seen Jeffrey Simmons a lot, but that was before his injury. We've got a couple of questions about that. I'll answer that later in the mailbag. But not a lot of other defensive tackles have come up, even though a lot of people kind of know about the impending free agency issue with Sheldon Richardson. So, I'm kind of curious what other defensive tackle prospects people might kind of slot into that spot. But again, I haven't been looking at it as thoroughly as the Daily Norseman tends to every year. So
have you seen anything that has just like frightened you or gone, what the hell is that?
I'm sure I'll find it. I saw a Mike Hughes mock last year that I was just like, that's ridiculous. So I shouldn't ever be too. Like, it was like one out of like the 30 mock drafts I looked at were like Mike Hughes to the Vikings. I'm like, wait, come on, man. They don't need a cornerback.
Why would we need a cornerback? We have a ridiculous amount of depth. I mean, even Terrence Newman's back there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm just like, Mac's probably going to have a bounce back year, which at least I was right about that. Terrence Newman's there, who cares? And then, cool. So, I should never be too vocal about, whether or not, a thing is likely to happen or unlikely to happen. But yeah, I haven't seen it. I will say the one that surprised me the most is Brugler's pick of Greedy Williams. I think it was Greedy Williams, the cornerback from LSU. I don't strongly agree with my colleague's pick.
Well, maybe there'll be time for it because we can talk about some dumb trade rumors, because dumb trade rumors are dumb.
Fantastic.
These are, oh my God. So, despite the fact that the Vikings have both Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen, there has been talk this week about trying to find a way to get Antonio Brown to the Vikings, or Odell Beckham has apparently apparently was on the trade the block without any other teams knowing about it until the Patriots tried to make a play, and then that was the end of that. So there's no possible way that Antonio Brown wears purple next year, correct?
I mean, I'll say that the likelihood is not zero, right? Like, yeah, I mean, but if I'm going to construct like a power ranking of teams that'll trade for Antonio Brown, the Vikings are certainly in the bottom third, right? Like 32 obviously is the Steelers, but like around 28, probably the Vikings, maybe 29. So it's not like zero, but like I think it's pretty tremendously unlikely. The issue is like, I think in a vacuum, you could find a way to justify it, right? The Vikings need a wide receiver 2. Wide receivers really susceptible to injuries, kind of hurting their production. A wide receiver, even wide receiver 3 upgrade might help you more than a starting guard would. I don't know if that's the case because, the positional value stuff that PFF has been working on kind of just assumes a starter, wide receiver 1 or 2 versus a starter at guard. So I don't know if a starter versus a heavy rotational depth guy at a position with a lot more value matters. I don't know. Intuitively, it's not true, but sometimes math doesn't quite work with your intuition, and maybe the math here kind of says something. Obviously, it would like improve the team, right? But the problem is, are the Vikings likely to pay a trade price higher than a team that needs a starting wide receiver, right? Because what the Vikings are essentially doing is they're pushing Stephon Diggs or Adam Thielen to wide receiver 3, because Antonio Brown's wide receiver 1. You've got 3 receivers with like the same skill set, which, I mean, like, who cares if they're as good as Antonio Brown, Stephon Diggs, and Adam Thielen? Fine. Like, who cares if they have the same skill set? But it is weird. It undoubtedly improves the team. It probably improves the team more than the cost of the trade if you use those trade assets elsewhere, like a second round pick or whatever, right? It only costs $12 million, which is a bargain given that it's Antonio Brown. And if the Vikings, again, are really creative and aggressive about the way that they manage the cap, they can sign, Anthony Harris and Tom Johnson and Tom Compton and Nick Easton and whoever you want, and either Anthony Barr or Sheldon Richardson, and still have like and reserve space for the draft and all that, and still actually have like $16 million of cap left if you structure the contract so that Anthony Harris only gets $2 million in year one and assuming he has $5.5 million average, and Anthony Barr/Sheldon Richardson have $3 million in year one, assuming they have a $10 million average. You can do all of that and have $16 million, so long as you like cut Sendejo, cut or trade Sendejo, cut or trade Remmers, and restructure Everson Griffin down to like $3.5 million or something like that for the year. You can do all of that and have $60 million. So you can get Antonio Brown at 12 and then have the $4 million of buffer space that you need to deal with injuries as the season kind of progresses. Like, fine. But like, another team is going to want him more, right? Because you're basically upgrading Laquan Treadwell or Aldrick Robinson, depending on like whoever gets more snaps, which this year, for some reason, I think it was Treadwell. Well, they didn't acquire Aldrick Robinson right away, but still. You're trading the 200 yards that you're going to get from that position, maybe 300 if you combine the two, or 400 or something like that, to 800. So 400 additional yards, let's say that. Because I don't see three receivers getting 1,000 yards. Like, obviously that's happened in the past for the Vikings, but right, because I think three deep had 1,000, but if not, we've seen across the NFL other teams have 3 1,000-yard receivers, including, I believe, the greatest show on turf. So okay, maybe 900, right? So you have 500 additional yards through the air. There's a team that's going to go from like 600 to 1,300, right, with Antonio Brown. And then the wide receiver 2 position is going to go from like 400 to 900 or something like that, right? Like, they're going to get like 1,000 more yards because of replacing wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 with the previous wide receiver 1 or something like that. Like, some team is going to get maybe 1,000 more yards, maybe 800 more yards, whereas the Vikings are going to get 400 to 500 more yards. That team's going to trade, and they have more cap space, and maybe they can, do more with it. That team's going to trade more assets for that because they're going to get more out of it. So I just don't see the Vikings doing it, not because the Vikings don't want to do it. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if they generically in a vacuum paid a price to get Antonio Brown, right? Like, even though they've got these great receivers. But I'd be surprised if they were the top bidder. And that's the thing. So yeah, like, I just don't see it happening. I do have some problem with the level of conversation that we're having about it, because like, not like you and I, because now we're just responding to the level of conversation that already exists, but like, who cares, right? Like, it's not going to happen. So why are we arguing about it? Also, why are we arguing about it if it is likely to happen? Because a lot of people are like, well, just you don't get Antonio Brown, get an offensive lineman. And it's like, they're not friggin' mutually exclusive, man. You can get like a guard. And also, like, at some level, does Antonio Brown improve your team more than a starting guard? Almost certainly, for like everybody. Like, does getting a Hall of Fame receiver improve your team more than like Brandon Fusco? Like, yeah. Like, that's like, of course.
But the problem is that people take a look at the situation and they say, well, I forget if this was a tweet or not. I think it was a tweet from earlier today that if you look at last year's Vikings and say that Kirk Cousins didn't succeed because of a lack of talent around him, you're a moron. So like, the idea that
so that's Nick Olson's argument, and I totally get it and understand that framing. Well, okay, so here are 2 tweets that I saw that I want to respond to. So that first one's the Nick Olson one. That makes a ton of sense, right? That framework for evaluation about how to build a team makes a ton of sense, but it's not one I subscribe to, because I don't really think about it as, what are the problems? Here are the solutions. I think about it in terms of, how many wins do you add with this move, right? So some problems can remain problems, but still, if you turn a strength into a stronger strength, you may still add more wins. And so it's actually better to do it by quote unquote ignoring a problem and adding to a strength that you already have. And the Patriots do it all the time. Like, how good's their wide receiver core? It's so bad that Julian Edelman is like the second most playoff yards in receiver history. So like, it's just a bad receiving core. So it's a problem. But like, they continue to kind of not address it. And I'm not saying they've done nothing about it, right? They continue to like try to find people to compete, and sometimes they like trade, or sometimes they spend a second round pick or whatever, like on Aaron Dobson. But they're bad at receiver. Like it's fine to say that. Like if Hogan is your receiver 2, like crap. He's a great receiver 3, but like, come on. But they spent, a bunch of money on defensive backs, right? Like they already, Stephen Gilmore, and they're like, let's get Jason McCourty, who didn't cost a ton. But, they've already got a heavy contract for like Devin McCourty, right? And they keep on acquiring defensive backs. And it's like, at some point you're like, why do you keep on acquiring defensive backs? Well, because, for them, Tom Brady kind of obviates the need for receiver talent, which is not to say that receiver talent plus Tom Brady isn't a good combination. I think we've like seen some pretty good Patriots teams with some pretty good receivers, but it just makes a lot more sense to invest at a place that you're already strong at, because it adds more wins just because of the nature of the situation. So I get it. Like the problem with the passing offense for the Vikings or for Kirk Cousins or whatever was not a lack of skill talent. Obviously, that's not a problem. But I don't really think of team building in terms of what are the problems, what are the solutions. I just think of it in terms of ways to add wins, right? And so often those two overlap a lot, because the biggest area to add wins often comes at the area where you're going to get the most marginal improvement, i.e. problems, right? So an average starting guard is going to improve a team that has a problem at guard way more than it's going to improve a team that has like an old guy they want to replace, right? Who's like fine, but you don't have. So like, obviously there's a lot of overlap, but sometimes there's not. And sometimes you draft a corner when you need a guard. And, I don't think the Vikings really made the right decision last year, because they went from an average tackle to an average tackle with that move, but at least they have a long-term solution, so it's not without merit. But, there's some sense to it, because, that cornerback over the long run is in theory going to improve the team way more than a guard would in the long run, because now you don't have to pay like Trey Waynes or whatever, right? So like, it's not always about, well, what are the team needs? What are the ways to solve it? It's really about what are the ways to add the most wins. And Antonio Brown does not resolve a problem because there's no problem there, but he may add more wins anyway, just because of the level of talent that he provides. So I get it, but that's not really the framework that I kind of approach it. The second one was from Adam Patrick at Straight Cash Homie. Sorry, I'm going to call you out, dude. You have this like tweet about how like trading for Robbie Gould, which I understand Robbie Gould's a free agent, and someone corrected you in the replies. It doesn't matter. In theory, let's say Robbie Gould is under contract and you needed to trade for him, or they franchise him. They're like, trading for Robbie Gould would add more wins than trading for Antonio Brown. Incorrect. He would have added like 18 more points to the Vikings this year. Like if you replaced all of Dan Bailey's kicks, and I understand like Daniel Carlson for the first half of the season, whatever, right? Like, so Dan Bailey has like a career bad year, right? And he still finishes making every kick over the last 4 games or something like that. But he has a career bad year. And Robbie Gould has one of his career best years. He's like 97% on field goals. He's like 100% or something on extra points. He had an amazing year, right? And so if you gave Dan Bailey the 97%, he makes like 3 more field goals. Or 6 more field goals, not 3, 6 more field goals. So that's 18 points. I just feel like Antonio Brown adds more than 18 more points than Laquan Treadwell. Like that's absurd. Plus Dan Bailey, I think, is going to bounce back. And I think Robbie Gould will continue to play at an extraordinarily high level and still drop from his like insane. He missed 1 field goal this year. Like he's probably going to miss more next year. Don't quote me on that. But he's probably going to miss more than 1 next year. So like you take the positive regression from Bailey and the negative regression from Robbie Gould, and you're looking at like 4 field goals maybe. And so, like, I think Brown is going to add more than 2 touchdowns. Clearly.
Well, I suppose that all depends. If he's going to be, is he the fastest human being on the planet? Because some of those overthrows, if he was the fastest man on the planet, could have been caught.
That's true. They should trade for Mike Wallace.
Exactly. Oh. Jerome Simpson in a package deal? Oh.
How come he's not in the AAF? I would like to see that.
That would be.
And flipping over, some cornerback from Kent State or whatever.
Oh, God. Yeah, the other trade thing that keeps popping up is people keep having this terrible idea that Case Keenum needs to come back home to Minnesota, which Case Keenum has played a million places. I don't know if Minnesota's necessarily home.
Yeah, come back home-ish. I mean, that was mostly a Pro Football Talk Mike Florio thing. Come on. No. Like, Zimmer, the least math guy in I think among the head coaches, except for maybe the Mike Vrabel, right? Like, basically the least math guy, the least analytics guy, looked at Case Keenum play and it was like, that is unsustainable. Like that statistically that will not continue, right? Like, everyone agreed. Like, most of the analytics guys were like, yeah, Case Keenum's having an aberrant year. It's unsustainable. And the film guys were like, yeah, Case Keenum's having an aberrant year. It's unsustainable. And then he proves it in Denver. And Florio's like, yeah, you need to bring Case Keenum back. And it's how does that even work, right? Cousins has a no trade clause. And why would he waive it? And if he did waive it, how much are the Vikings on the hook for? Which I don't even know how trade math works. Maybe only on the hook for $3 million from the proration from a signing bonus, because with a fully guaranteed contract, why would you put a bunch in the signing bonus anyway? But still, it's just that's a lot of work for nothing. Plus, I mean, I've been criticizing Kirk Cousins all year. I don't know if you've seen it, but I've been pretty critical of him. And even I'm just well, give him another year, dude. That's insane. I'm not saying the Vikings should find some magical way to move on, even though they can't, from Kirk Cousins. But if they had the option, I still would just be well, wait a year, man. Let's see what happens if you give him an offensive line. Because my stance has always been that Cousins is a force multiplier. If you've got a really bad supporting cast, he's going to make your team look worse than it is. And if you've got a really good supporting cast, he's going to make it look better than it is. So, give him an offensive line and the team's going to look great. Okay. So yeah, the moving on from Kirk Cousins bit, I don't get. The getting Case Keenum bit, which, I mean, Denver's already moving on, right? That's clear. So they're going to take a $10 million hit just to get rid of Case Keenum because they've moved on and grabbed Joe Flacco of all people, and they're going to draft probably Drew Lock to sit behind him. No, he's been bad everywhere except once. Admittedly, it was with the Vikings. And even the Vikings were like, man, I don't know. So, yeah. That's silly.
Yeah, just let him go to Jacksonville, or let him go to, oh, God. Where else could they possibly need a quarterback? Washington. Let him go to Washington. Let him...
Yeah, actually, I kind of like that fit. Just do it.
Yeah,
come on, Washington.
Just send him over there. Well, yeah, he hasn't done anything horribly wrong that would involve the commissioner's list or anything, so he might not be their type of quarterback or their type of player, quite frankly. Yet.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he's a good person, so I don't know that he's a good culture fit in Washington.
So Kirk Cousins and Twitter need to have a breakup, I think. They need to see different people. They need to be away from each other because Vikings fans can't have nice things. And clearly Kirk Cousins is just he's too nice for this world. He's too nice for Vikings Twitter.
It's... So the weird thing is, Kirk Cousins will tweet something, right? Usually innocuous. what should I give away? A signed football, a signed jersey, a signed football card? I don't know. And someone will be like, win us a Super Bowl, right? It's just like, that's what fans do. They're like all humans, they're shitty. Maybe I should say like all groups of humans, right? Because I just put out that Case Keenum's a good guy. But like all sufficiently large groups of people, they're like bad and awful. And so, he'll tweet something out like, hey, I'm going to do something nice. And someone's like, why don't you do something nice like winning a Super Bowl or whatever? Pretty standard stuff. I see people like tweet crap at me all the time when I tweet like I just tweeted out like, hey, here's some of the best players from last weekend of AAF. And someone was like, suck it, Arif, no one cares. Which like...
Sorry, that was me.
Yeah, oh, yeah, okay. Well, you forgot to turn your burner account on, so next time. But yeah, it's just like, I'm not saying like blame the victim or whatever. Like if he didn't know that was going to be a product of Twitter, then he didn't know, and that kind of sucks. But like the thing that bothers me is not like if it like sucks for him, I feel bad. The thing that bothers me is not that like he didn't know that, but rather that like people are screenshotting the shitty replies and are just like, I can't believe people would do this. And it's like, yeah, you can. Of course you can. You went into the replies to look for it, man.
You're on Twitter. You know these things exist.
Right? Yeah. Like, of course you knew that was going to happen. Why would you ever look at the comments of like at Vikings or at Kirk Cousins, right? It's to look for the shitty replies. Like, of course. And then like people get mad about it, and everyone with like a check mark is like, yeah, this can't stand. It's like, yeah, we all agree that it's bad that they did the bad thing. But there's not like a thing we can do about it. We can all just kind of moralize. Like, yeah, that sucks. So I don't, and then like he tweeted, like, I didn't even look at the replies, but people are talking about it. He tweeted like, yeah, I can see why LeBron James went to Miami. This place is awesome. That's a perfectly innocuous tweet. And everybody whose like name is attached to the Twitter account essentially agrees. It's like, yeah, it doesn't really matter. He's like on vacation in Miami. Cool. That's where I would go. Like, that makes sense. But like people are like angry. I'm not even sure why. Maybe he's not like working on football at this very moment, which actually that doesn't even make sense because so many players work out in Florida in the off season that actually that's probably where he should go. But like, yeah, I assume that's what the problem is, or people are like, please stay in Minnesota where it's -20 and we're about to hit the record snowfall for the month of February. Like, I don't know, like why you would demand that of like a human who has the ability to not do that. But sure, fine. You have to stay in Minnesota or you have to work on football or. Like whatever reason people are mad that people are mad.
Maybe he just needs to do the Blake Bortles thing and just block everyone.
That's the Blaine Gabbert thing.
Oh, the Blaine Gabbert, that's right.
Yeah, your Jacksonville quarterback.
Boy, and who can't relate to that?
You're right. But I mean, like, yeah, I guess. I don't know, like, why we're surprised or... I'm not even, like, angry that people are angry. I'm just like, yeah, I guess. I mean, like, people got mad when Keenan Allen, he was, like, drafted by the Chargers or whoever. I should know who Keenan Allen friggin' plays for. When he was drafted by the Chargers, he, like, on Instagram was, like, at an In-N-Out wearing a Raiders hat, which, like, admittedly, like, dumb move. But, like, obviously it was, like, a fashion choice, right? There's, like, a lot of people that wear team colors because the colors look good with their outfit. And they don't really care about the team. I mean, like, watch Entourage. Turtle does that, like, all the time. I actually have not willingly watched a single episode of the Entourage, and I've seen, like, 20 because of my college roommate. But that happens, right? And people got, like, big angry about it. And then people got big angry about the people who were angry. And it's like, well, that one's even more reasonable to be angry about. Cousins is just, like, tweeting about being in the city of Miami at a time when he has literally no obligations. So, like, whatever. People are talking about it a lot. I don't know why. Who cares? People are talking about the Antonio Brown stuff. I don't know why. Who cares? People are talking about this Case Keenum rumor that appeared out of the ether when Pro Football Talk tweeted it. I don't know why. Who cares? Talk about like draft prospects or whatever. Like talk about stuff that might
because
substantially
everyone's
happen.
sick of draft stuff already. We don't want draft stuff. All we
I
want to
haven't
talk
seen
about.
like any Vikings people talk about the draft. Like honestly, I'm shocked. Like it's like Luke Inman. That's like it, man. Like let's talk about like you all want to talk about guards so much. You're all sick of Matthew Collar talking about Antonio Brown and a demand that he talk about guards. Why don't you just talk about guards? Talk about how like dope Chris Lindstrom is or Elton J. Be the change you want to see in the world. Take Gandhi's advice about genuine social change and apply it to this area of the world that doesn't matter, football Twitter. Like just talk about like the draft or like free. Like, do you want to sign Roger Saffold? I've seen like a bunch of people like ask me that, which is fine, but like. I haven't seen a bunch of people like tweet about like the pros and cons of signing Roger Saffold versus Ramon Foster or whatever, right? Like, if you're angry at Matthew Collar for talking about Antonio Brown, talk about something else. It doesn't matter. Like, if it's during the season and he's talking about how Kirk Cousins can't like win or whatever, like that's a relevant conversation that is like substantial to your rooting interest, which is the Vikings, right? And so you can have a debate about Kirk Cousins, and because it's like an online debate, we'll get mad, and I'm fine. I actually I was just being like pejorative of it, but like, yeah, I mean, it's fine. You get mad about stuff you care about, fine. But like, you don't care about Antonio Brown coming to the Vikings, so but you're mad about it. Just talk about guards. Just do it.
Well, let's go to the mailbag, and the first question is from Ryan, who asks, how many football leagues will it take before Arif finally suffers from sports betting fatigue?
Probably like 3 more. So like XFL, FXFL, which I think is the Fall Experimental Football League, which I don't think exists anymore. And what's a third one?
You gonna start betting on arena football? Is that still a thing?
I was about to say televised arena football is probably the next one. So
not even televised, like not even new games. They're just gonna be showing old games, and you're not allowed to Google. Like that
sounds really fun. Actually, I would bet on that.
It's arena football on like ESPN Classic or something.
Right, and they just got like live betting, and they can just find a way to make sure that you don't know the outcome of stuff. Like,
exactly. Like I kind of remember. Wait, is that Kurt Warner? He's probably gonna.
Hey, Nick Truesdell. The Vikings grabbed him at training camp. Cool.
Alexander asks, "Would you take Jeffrey Simmons at 50?"
Yeah. So this is the mailbag question I referenced. So there's 2 issues with Simmons. The first one is the most recent one that popped up, the injury that I think it's like an Achilles. Like it's not an ACL, it's an Achilles, which can have pretty substantial impact, and you're not going to get him healthy in time for the season. Yeah, I think he's really good. And I think, obviously you have to talk to your medical staff and see if he'll recover and all that. But yeah, I think so. The second one involves, I think people are calling it domestic violence. I don't agree with that framing. I talked about this in the Football Machine, that I think domestic violence needs to be reserved for things like interpersonal relationships. And this is like a woman that he basically didn't know that was fighting with his sister. And he broke up the fight, and he went way too far. He went substantially way too far. And so based on the description of the events, it sounded like he like blacked out, which is very symptomatic. Like he doesn't remember. And so it's very symptomatic of an actual anger management issue that can be treated with anger management counseling, which domestic violence cases very often cannot, because that's very often attitudinal rather than specific to like issues dealing with anger. It's about historically, it's about like the relationship that you perceive with like women and their place in society versus like an anger management issue. And those that one's like a very kind of dangerous one, but that's also a little bit easier to treat. So I would be willing to take him on kind of despite that. So yeah, I would draft him at 50 with both of those issues, because I think he's a really fantastic player. And even if you're not going to get year one production out of him, I think that you get really great long-term both like asset value, and then also I think he's just a good player. Plus, most of the time when like a domestic violence issue occurs, and then you hear like the player was like this model player in their community or whatever, I kind of don't care. But I think when it's like an anger management issue and like literally everyone who's been in contact with him since he arrived on campus, because this issue happened, I think he's like an early enrollee, but it happened in high school and they were considering withdrawing a scholarship or whatever. But since he stepped foot on campus, like everyone who's been in contact with him has been very effusive in their praise of him. And he recognizes that this is an anger management issue and that he's seeking treatment for it. Given all of that, I think that is important and substantial. So, the signs are positive. The injury, obviously, you have to pass that to the injury staff, but yeah, I would take him because you don't have to pay a bunch for a valuable position.
All right, next question is also from Alexander, who asks, list a name or two the Vikings would jump back into the end of the first round for.
I could see it for Chris Lindstrom, who is, I think, a pretty high-level guard based off of that second round of viewing that I had. I could see it for Dalton Reisner. Again, I have no idea kind of where he's going to fall based off of where people have put him. But if instead of the second round, it's the bottom of the first, you could see potentially that cliff in value that leads to good trades. I could see it for Dalton Reisner. So those two, I wouldn't be surprised if the Vikings went kind of off path again in the first round and drafted not an offensive lineman, maybe Hawkinson, and then jumped back into the first round for that offensive lineman.
Well, they do like trading back into the first round. Bill Botke says the Vikings are in win now mode, but the future is important as well. If injured Mississippi State defensive tackle Jeffrey Simmons was available late in round 2, would it make sense strategically for the Vikings to draft him there, or would they be better off picking someone who can play this year?
Yeah, well, it kind of so I already answered this a little bit, but to kind of expand on this, immediate returns versus long run stuff, it may also depend on kind of what you're doing in round 1, whether or not you're getting a starter from this year and adding an asset that has the ability to make an immediate impact. You are getting Mike Hughes back. Maybe he makes an immediate impact. But, it depends. Like if it's a defensive tackle, if you re-sign Tom Johnson and have him play one more year, I mean, he's like 37 now. So like, who knows when he's going to fall off, but you take that risk and he plays one more year. Now you've got a plan, right? So, I think that you can still maintain some of your kind of win now tendencies. Maybe franchise Sheldon Richardson, right? And still kind of build for the long term without really hurting yourself in the short term.
All right, next question is from Raul, who says, this offseason, would you rather the Vikings find a number 3 wide receiver or a number 2 tight end?
Number 3 wide receiver. I think that position just matters a lot more, especially when you're talking about like backups. I think wide receivers are a little bit more sensitive to injury than tight ends are, which is not to say they injure more often, but they're impacted more by the injuries that occur. I think you'll see wide receiver 3 on the field much more than you see tight end 2, even though like the prospect of 2 tight end sets is really tantalizing. And the way the Eagles use 2 tight end sets really would translate really well for the Vikings, just in terms of you can pass a run or play action out of them really well. Like that all translates, I think, well for the Vikings. But I just think you get more out of that wide receiver 3.
Also from Raul, more of a philosophical question, but who's the safer interior line prospect? The offensive tackle who has good technique but athletic limitations, or the interior offensive lineman with good athleticism but poor technique?
The tackle. Obviously, it kind of depends on your definition of safe, the definitions that you use for athleticism and technique, and the specific nature of the limitations in question. So if an offensive lineman has bad footwork, that's difficult. If they have bad hand fighting technique, that's something you might be able to actually fix within the year. So it all really depends on the parameters, but largely speaking, I would say moving a less athletic tackle to guard actually does tend to be safer than a guard with very little in terms of technical capability, because it is difficult to develop that technique in the NFL when there's such little coaching time and much more game planning time. I mean, it happens a lot. I think that a lot of people want to, get kind of annoyed when we talk about a tackle prospect playing guard. And I kind of do too, because I think height really doesn't matter all that much for tackles as much as the NFL seems to think. And so like moving Isaiah Wynn to guard, I think didn't make a ton of sense. I'm really glad the Patriots think of him as a tackle, kind of excited to see him next year, and so on. But I think that a lot of good guards come from tackles moving inside, like Roger Saffold, right, the free agent. So I think that that's kind of the direction you want to go in. A lot of college teams will put their best offensive linemen just at tackle, and if they're just a better fit at guard for you in the NFL, that's fine.
During the 2017 season, I asked Arif a question about the sustainability of the Vikings' third down defense because I was skeptical of the idea that different performance on different downs was explained by a much more than a statistical variance. One of Arif's counterexamples to my skepticism was the Greatest Show on Turf Rams, as he pointed out that they came into existence when the Rams realized their third down playbook from the year before was so wildly successful, they should just make it their entire offense. Now that the Vikings have 2 years in a row had a historically great third down defense under their belt, should they also be looking into expanding their third down playbook concepts into every down of their defense?
I really like this idea. I don't think it would translate. I think they should do it a little more often for sure. I don't think it would necessarily translate well because one of the things that works out really well for the Vikings on third down is their ability to figure out what the opponent is doing. Anything 3rd and 4 or longer is almost always going to be a passing play. Anything 3rd and 2 and shorter, that's a little bit more difficult to tell. And then 3rd and 3, there's a pretty good mix there, but 3rd and 2 and shorter are going to at least likely be tight to the line of scrimmage, which I think is bad strategy, but it happens a lot with NFL offenses. So, and there's still a very high proportion of runs. Really one of the reasons that the Vikings were so successful on third down is because in third and short situations, they've got such an amazing interior that they create a lot of tackles for losses. And that's Lidval Joseph. And then 3rd and long, they're really good because they design these like phenomenal blitzes that honestly would not work all that well if they genuinely had to worry about the threat of the run. And that's not something that you can do on 1st and 10. So I don't think you can adapt a lot of it, but I think you can be more aggressive about when you do it. So on 2nd and 15, right? I think that's an example of when you want to use your third down defense. But 2nd and 10 is not, because teams are very, very likely to run out of that, because usually 2nd and 10 comes as a result of a failed pass play. And because humans are really bad at breaking patterns, a failed pass play often leads to a run play. But 2nd and 9, I would do it. 2nd and 8, I would do it. 2nd and 15, I would do it. It really, I think, depends on your ability to have faith in the tendencies that you read from your opponent. And one of the reasons the Vikings are so good on third down is because they've got really great situational football that is almost contingent upon their ability to kind of predict what their opponent does on third down. So I don't know if you'd be able to kind of move it completely in that direction, but I like the idea of moving it in that direction more often because I don't think the Vikings do that enough.
All right, next question is from Don from Ohio, who says, if the Colts called and wanted to trade Quentin Nelson for Danielle Hunter straight up, would you do the trade?
Quentin Nelson for Danielle Hunter?
That's what he said.
Absolutely not.
Not even going to entertain that one, huh?
Yeah, Danielle Hunter is like the 8th best defensive end, who's got like the highest ceiling, right? But like the 8th best pass rusher, edge rusher in the NFL, and Quentin Nelson's like a top 4 guard. A lot of people are calling him the best guard in the NFL, which I appreciate that, but no, he's not. Which is fine. He might be the best guard in the NFL next year, whereas I don't think Danielle Hunter will be the best edge rusher in the NFL next year. Hope I'm wrong. That'd be great. But edge rusher is just so much more valuable than guard. And, obviously the Vikings could use a guard more than they can use an edge rusher. But like people are like really high on like Stephen Weatherly, and he's like a really good backup. I don't think he's a quality starter, or at least kind of the starter that we're used to seeing in Minnesota. So if you trade Danielle Hunter away, you're really expecting Stephen Weatherly or Deshaun Bauer to step up in a way that I think shows a lot more faith in them or reads a lot more from their performances than is already there. It also means you don't have a ton of leverage to renegotiate Everson Griffin's contract. So yeah, I wouldn't do that. Quentin Nelson's real good though.
Yeah. Also, he has a bit of a concern. He says, guys, I'm a bit concerned Norse Code is not as hip and cool as it used to be. I'm not sure we were either, but with Dusty O'Connell trying to become an adult, Arif actually getting paid for articles, and James taking care of 22 kids now, how in the hell will you guys try to keep up with these cool new podcasts?
We won't.
No, we're
gradually
old.
Fade away. Yeah.
we're old. We're not quite old man Vikings podcast, but we're old. No, I don't know if we're. What's the line from Grandpa Simpson that once I figured out what cool and hip was, and then I think it was Homer that said, it'll happen to you. I used to be hip. I used to be with it, and they changed what it and with it were. Something like that. Double Oh My God asks, what does Arif think of quarterback Brett Rippon?
Yeah, I think he's pretty cool. Boise State quarterback. He's probably underrated. This draft is not great for quarterbacks, so Rippon might be a quote-unquote late riser. The people I've talked to who've watched him, people like Kyle Krabs and Derek Clausen, really, really like what they've seen from him from the perspective of him being kind of a mid-round prospect that a lot of people have talked about. That said, I've watched like one game, so I couldn't even really talk with confidence about like his qualities and stuff like that. I've liked what I've seen. More importantly, the people I trust in these kind of quarterback evaluations, like what they've seen. And it really sucks that he didn't get a Senior Bowl invite because we would have been able to see, I think, a lot of, because the quarterbacks at the Senior Bowl, they performed really poorly. Like they were bad. So it would have been nice to see Rippon. Maybe he would have shined. But I think he will be a quote-unquote late riser, and then he might get overdrafted anyway because it's such a weak class. So yeah, we'll see. I mean, he's clearly got limitations, but I think that he'll be a good backup for somebody. The Vikings just don't draft backup quarterbacks, so I don't really see him as they haven't forever now. So I don't see him as a target for the Vikings, but if they grabbed him in like the 5th round or whatever, that's a good pick.
Next question is from Eddie, who asks, in the event of the zombie apocalypse or other dystopian nightmare, are we underestimating the potential chaos caused by widespread caffeine withdrawal?
Who wrote that?
That was Eddie on Twitter.
Oh, okay. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
It really, I don't know if you've watched Bird Box or anything.
I've not watched Bird Box. I watched A Quiet Place, which is the same thing but with a different sense.
Pretty much, actually, because I saw The Quiet Place, and yeah, that was basically the same idea. Yeah, I wonder what a caffeine withdrawal. Because as far as I can tell, the only three ways that anything gets done in this country is through caffeine, Adderall, or cocaine. So if you take away all three of those, I don't know how anything gets done.
Like a mass migration to Colombia.
Or wherever anything else happens, yes.
Right. I mean, that's... Caffeine withdrawal has not, for me, led to a burst of activity. It's like headaches and stuff. And
cigarettes too. I mean, let's
right,
if cigarettes are totally taken out of the equation, at least there's going to be like a week or two of just misery.
Right. Yeah. It's
in
brutal,
the middle
right?
of post-apocalyptic world.
It's like,
misery.
These zombies. I can't.
I need my Reds.
I don't have clean water. I can barely get enough food to eat. I gulp down this Snickers and I'm already crashing on the sugar high. I don't have enough energy. I've got really poor nutrition. I'm bleeding. But man, this headache is real bad.
this headache, boy, it really puts the whole post-apocalyptic setting into perspective.
Right. It's like, yeah, I've got like a sprained ankle that I'm just kind of limping around on. And, I've probably got an infectious disease I need to fight and I need to find some meds for that. But like the coffee shop's right there. The pharmacy is like down the block. I gotta see if I could just chew on some coffee beans or something.
I'm stuck on the cigarettes thing because I'm, the one of the worst things that can happen to a smoker is to go out for a smoke and then realize you don't have fire. Because it's so like the idea that, maybe you had to torch that zombie and now you no longer have a lighter, but you have a fresh pack of Reds. Like there's nothing, there are a few things
like, was that even worth it?
Exactly. Like, well, I mean, I'm living, but is this really life? So
no, I hadn't thought about that. Now that it affects me personally, I'm scared.
Let's go to Matt McKeon, who says, the AAF appears to offer an interesting experimental ground for rule changes. Which AAF rules that you've seen so far do you think the NFL should consider, such as no kickoffs? And which, as yet untried ones, would you like to see the AAF explore?
I don't actually like the no kickoffs thing. I like kickoffs. I just don't like the commercials between the kickoffs and play. But I recognize that I have a bias in that I have watched a lot of Percy Harvin and Cordero Patterson kickoff returns.
Yes.
So I just happen to think that they're way more exciting than they are. John Boyce, who has not produced a bad video yet, they're all good, also has a good video on why we should ban the kickoff, and it's insanely compelling. And like, dang, like that's really good. It's a good argument. It's a good video. All of his videos are good. So redundant, sorry. But he even points out, he's like, the one exception to this rule is Cordero Patterson. And we're just like, oh, that's why I disagree. Oh, if you don't have him, it sucks. Okay, I get it now. Like I just thought the Vikings were just not good at kick returner. It turns out no one is, except the Patriots now, which, of course. Yeah, it's probably a good idea. Get rid of the extra points for 2-point conversions. Love it. But I kind of want kickers to matter. I'm weird like that. So it is weird that they only matter on field goals, but yeah, I guess I'll adjust to it. So that's fine. I really wish we could see some, not mechanization, but like some actualization of the onside kick version of the no kickoff rule, which is, I think it's like 4th and 12 or whatever. And you have to convert that. I want to see that. Not that I don't know what that would look like, because I've seen teams on 4th and 12 go for it. I don't even know if it's 4th and 12. It's 4th and something. But like that would be cool, and I love that idea. But honestly, I think actually instead of just giving the ball away at the 25, it should just be 4th and 12 from your own 40 or something, and you can choose to punt or you can choose to try and convert. And so I think that's better, because then you can always have a quote unquote onside kick. But yeah, I kind of like that. So I guess an expansion would be if they just allowed that to happen at any time, as opposed to if you're down in the final 7 minutes or whatever the specifics of the rule are. That's cool. Yeah, I don't know what additional rules I would. Make pass interference reviewable. Duh. I haven't seen a lot of pass interference called in the AAF, which another reason to watch.
Yeah, another reason to watch. The way in which they do the reviews is compelling, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. The transfer. Yeah, that should definitely be in the NFL, where the Sky God, or whatever they call him, the Sky God reviews the plays.
Sky God reviews the play.
And has an open conversation in front of a camera, and they explain their thought process essentially, and then call down to the ref on the field what the review is. So the ref is not involved in the review. The Sky God obviously has a bias to let the call stand unless there's significant enough evidence to overturn. But it's just nice to see them go through their process, and it might encourage, fair reviews. But more importantly, I think it decreases the amount of backlash against bad reviews or something like that. So, so it makes it seem like it encourages fairer reviewers, even if it's the same process. So, yeah, cameras on the Sky God and having a Sky God instead of the ref review, which I don't think refs even review anymore. They just have this show of the refs reviewing because of Microsoft.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. And, if we were to do something where in the NFL there was the open review policy like in the AAF, people like Mike Pereira might be out of a job. And, that would just be a darn shame, wouldn't it?
Yeah, dang.
I don't know how I would watch football without Mike Pereira. I don't know. Is that allowed?
Right.
Like, I know
right,
CBS has a guy, but like,
can we do that?
No, I don't know. Brian Jellerson, how does it work if an NFL team wants to pull up a player from the AAF? And do you see the AAF having any sort of effect on the way NFL teams approach the draft?
I don't know about the draft. I would be interested to hear what people think the knock-on effects of the AAF have on the draft are. But hey, maybe a certain type of player is not getting a chance, and if that player consistently does well in the AAF, you're more likely to draft that certain type of player. So like undersized receivers or whatever, or undersized quarterbacks. Looking at you, John Wolford. The thing about NFL teams interested in AAF players, I'm like kind of curious because I've heard conflicting things. So the AAF has written in its rules that you cannot sign with another league except for the NFL. So the CFL or the XFL comes calling, the contract you sign prevents you from going to those leagues. But like, I think I assumed for a while that the NFL could just sign you at any time and that'd be fine. And that's how a lot of people wrote about it. But I've seen one article, and I think it was on CBS, and they're the ones that have the relationship with the AAF, so they would know. That said they have to wait until what is essentially the AAF offseason, so after April, which means that they can't sign players during the free agency signing period, which is then a risk for players that sign with the AAF. And if I was the AAF, I would not want that. I would absolutely want to sign players that are not scared that if the NFL team is interested in them during the free agency signing period, that they wouldn't sign them. Which, by the way, those players would not have been restricted. If you're not under contract, a team can sign you at any time. It just so happens that contracts end on like March 3rd and the signing period's like March 10th or whatever it is, right? So if you're under contract on March 3rd or the end of the league year, that's when the free agency. But you want to be able to compete in that market, whereas you don't want to compete in a market where teams have filled out their 90-man rosters and now you're available. But on the other hand, like if the NFL signs a player to like a decent contract, not like a minimum contract, and the player violates the terms of their agreement with the AAF, like what does the AAF do? Like, okay, fine, they sue. Now the player has a lot more money and they'll just pay out the rest of their contract. Great. Like, who cares? It's a $75,000 contract. The damages are not that high. So cool. But yeah, like it seems like they cannot sign with a team until the end of the AAF season, which is April 27th, which is basically the draft. But I just don't see what's stopping you from like breaching the contract and then just paying off whatever that is. So yeah, the initial language to me, I thought the NFL could sign them at any time. Maybe that's not the case.
Next question is from Kyle Slaby, who says, add the 2018 Clemson and Alabama to the AAF, assuming the draftees are still on the teams. Are they competing for the championship in the AAF this year?
Yeah, probably. Like, I've been adamant that the best college team cannot beat the worst NFL team several times on this podcast, even this year, because we talked about the Bills. who turned out to not be that team. It was like Arizona. But like this is like different, right? Because now you've got like Tua Tagovailoa or Trevor Lawrence competing against like Garrett Gilbert. Again, he's like the MVP of the league. He's doing fine. The NFL team should sign him. But like, would the best rookie quarterback beat the 33rd best quarterback? Probably. If it's like the 40th best quarterback, yeah. If it's the 65th best quarterback, okay, yeah, probably. And so, yeah, like I think the problem is that like the NFL concentrates all-star talent, right? Because there's no, even Clemson and Alabama, two of the best teams that we've seen in college football over the past decade, they just happen to be playing in the same year. Even if they, have all this all-star talent, they don't have all the best players in the country, especially on the same year. The NFL does. And they concentrate it from a pool of like 65,000 players to 1,000 players. And so the worst distribution of those 1,000 players among the 32 teams is still going to be better than this like phenomenal pool of draft picks that you get from like Alabama or whatever, right? But that's like not the case in the AAF. You've got like one first-round pick, a third-round pick, a fourth-round pick, and a fifth-round pick. That's like kind of like a college team, like a good college team, like a really good college team, but like a college team. So that maybe, yeah, because you're not doing the concentration of talent. You don't have like, you have like a bunch of, second team SEC, third team Big 12, like those are your stars. So yeah, I think so.
I would love to have Bomani and Jones back for just like to talk about the AAF and just the ridiculously. Like I would kill for that. Just be like,
it would be amazing.
Yeah. So why aren't they just violating it?
right. Yeah. But yeah, I think a lot of years the best college team probably wouldn't compete for the championship of the AAF. Probably, but like 2018 Clemson, Alabama. Yeah, I could see it.
Yeah, it's possible. Let's go with Kyle Segal, who says, describe your perfect burrito.
So flour tortilla, which that's like more controversial than it should be, but whatever. Flour tortilla, soft. You've got a guacamole. It depends on my mood, but I think generally a slow roasted brisket or something like that. Rice, but not like white rice, but that's been like kind of made with like a risotto instead of just like made into rice. The process for the chipotle beans, but if you make those beans yourself, it'd probably make them better. So like the same herbs and spices for the black beans, but the same herbs and spices for the black beans, but with red beans and bacon. So all of that. Lots of cilantro.
The addition of bacon, that's interesting.
Yeah. The raw red onion diced up real nice. Real nice.
Let those flavors get to know each other.
Yeah. Shout out Babish. 2-3 types of cheese, something like that. Wrap it all up, obviously appropriate to the size of your tortilla. And then the final bit is to sear 2 of the sides in butter. One to obviously close the tortilla up, and the other one because symmetry is good. But yeah, finishing it with the sear and butter. So it should be warm when you pack it so it doesn't like tear and stuff like that. But finishing it at the end with the sear and butter is amazing.
Well, I know now.
Did I say avocado / guacamole?
You did.
That's in there.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I now have something I need to do. I need to sear a burrito in butter, apparently.
Yeah, just the 2 sides, the seam side and the other side.
It's both sides. It's fine. It's fine. It's silly, but I like I do like a steak burrito. Brisket it seems like it's just like as I'm eating it, just feels like it's too much work inside of the brisket. Doesn't work for me in my.
Oh, you mean to like chew?
Yeah, like in the burrito form, it's just not as necessary. I feel like it's just a bit too. It's kind of like in the chicken aspect of things where it's like too stringy inside of a burrito.
You need to have better brisket, and also it should be chopped. Like, fine.
You just need to be eating better food, James.
Yeah, well, I mean that's my take on a lot of your food takes. So. Have you tried putting milk in cereal?
And with that is going to be the end of the episode. Arif, what do you have to plug?
If it is the end of the episode, here are my things to plug. A bunch of articles in The Athletic, AAF standouts, the thresholds that the Vikings use at the Combine. Right now, the only article up is the offensive players, the defensive players I'm working on right now, and a piece on Rick Dennison and another piece on Gary Kubiak. So those are my 4 things to plug. I'm also including in the show notes the John Boyce video, probably something about AAF's rules, and a piece on Jeffrey Simmons that talks about the anger management versus domestic violence distinction.
Well, that is going to be it. So if you've enjoyed the show, you know how to download and you know how to support the Norse Code. So that is going to be it. So for Arif, my name is James. Please remember to tweet that, even if it is a work in progress. And we'll be back in about 2 weeks. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.
That is going to be it. So for Arif, my name is James. James?
James.
Wow.
James Pagashnik.
Yeah, I read an article about kids watching Peppa Pig and gaining British accents, but this is ridiculous. I will say I've seen enough of Peppa Pig, but yeah, that's just wrong. That and the cancer patient Caillou. Let's come back here in 3, 2... Was that too much?
Wow.
Was that? Did I?
Given that it took me like 3 seconds to process.
They sell Caillou shampoo. Really? Really? The kid's clearly getting over chemotherapy. Like how?
You might have alopecia, man. It's fine.
Then why is he selling? Whatever. I want to keep this in so badly. All right. 3, 2, 1.